He brought his mistress to a luxury dinner. Then his pregnant wife walked in with his biggest rival. Benjamin Caldwell watched Manhattan glow through the tinted window of the town car, like a kingdom that belonged to him. Traffic moved slowly along the avenue, headlights sliding across the glass towers like rivers of light. People hurried along the sidewalks in coats and scarves, their breath turning white in the cold night air. Somewhere down the block, a taxi horn cut sharply through the noise of the city. Benjamin barely noticed any of it. He was staring at his own reflection in the window, 42 years old, perfectly fitted charcoal suit, a watch that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the kind of appearance that quietly told a room he expected to be taken seriously. For years, Manhattan had rewarded that expectation. Tonight would be no different. Outside the windshield, the glowing sign of one of the city's most exclusive steakhouses came into view, a place where investors made decisions that shaped entire industries. A place where men like Benjamin were treated with respect before they even spoke. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt slowly. Across the seat beside him sat the woman who had become part of the new image he was building. She looked exactly the way Manhattan's high-end nightlife magazines liked their photographs to look. Sleek black dress, long dark hair, confidence that seemed practiced in front of mirrors. When the car passed under a streetlight, the shimmer of her dress briefly reflected across the leather interior. She caught Benjamin watching and smiled. "Big night?" she asked. Benjamin allowed himself a small grin. You could say that. Tonight wasn't just dinner. Tonight was presentation. Several investors were waiting inside. Men who had backed his company since the beginning. Men who paid attention to details. How a man walked, who he brought into a room, what story he told about his life. Benjamin intended to give them a very clear story. The driver slowed the car as they approached the entrance. Valets in dark coats moved quickly along the curb, opening doors for arriving guests. Through the restaurant's massive glass windows, warm golden lights spilled across white tablecloths and polished marble floors. Benjamin leaned forward slightly, studying the entrance. He could already imagine how the evening would unfold. Handshakes, admiration, a few casual remarks about how life had changed recently. He glanced again toward the woman beside him. She fit the narrative perfectly. For months now, Benjamin had been slowly introducing her to certain circles, business gatherings, quiet parties, private dinners where the right people noticed the right things. Image mattered in Manhattan, more than most people admitted. And Benjamin Caldwell understood image better than almost anyone. He exhaled slowly as the car rolled to a stop at the curb. The driver stepped out and walked around to open the door. Benjamin straightened his jacket one last time. For a brief second, as he reached for the handle, something crossed his mind. A memory, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet echo from another night months earlier inside the apartment he once shared with Tiana. But Benjamin pushed the thought away before it could settle. That chapter was over. Tonight was about the future. And as Benjamin stepped out of the car into the glow of Manhattan's most powerful dining room, he believed completely that everything was still under his control. Inside the restaurant, the air carried that quiet confidence money tends to create. Soft jazz floated through the room. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light. Conversations at nearby tables stayed low and controlled, the way people speak when they know everyone around them is used to influence. Benjamin Caldwell liked rooms like this, rooms where people watched who walked in, rooms where reputation mattered. A hostess greeted him with instant recognition. "Good evening, Mr. Benjamin Caldwell." Benjamin nodded politely as she led them deeper into the restaurant toward the private dining section at the back. Several men in tailored suits were already seated there, reviewing wine lists and speaking in quiet tones. When Benjamin approached, they stood immediately. Handshakes followed, firm grips, familiar smiles. "Benjamin," one of the investors said warmly. "Good to see you." "Always a pleasure," Benjamin replied smoothly. He gestured toward the woman beside him. "This evening felt like a good time to introduce someone important in my life." The investors exchanged curious glances, but remained polite. They had heard rumors already. Manhattan always heard rumors. As everyone settled into their chairs, a waiter appeared with menus and a bottle of wine. Benjamin leaned back comfortably. For a moment, he simply watched the room, enjoying the attention that naturally settled around him. Then one of the investors asked carefully, "We heard there have been personal changes recently." Benjamin smiled. "Yes, there have. He lifted his glass slightly. "My marriage is coming to an end." The words landed softly across the table. No drama, just a statement. Benjamin glanced down briefly at the dark surface of the wine inside his glass. The reflection there triggered something he hadn't expected. A memory, the last serious conversation he had with Tiana. Her standing in the living room, trying to talk about the company finances, trying to ask questions he didn't want to hear, trying to warn him. Benjamin remembered the frustration in his own voice that night, the arrogance he didn't bother hiding anymore, and finally, the sentence that ended everything. "You were never really my type anyway." At the time, the words felt like freedom. Now the memory lingered longer than he expected. Benjamin took a quick sip of wine and forced the thought away. "That chapter of my life is finished," he said calmly to the table. "Sometimes you outgrow situations that no longer match the direction you're headed." The investors nodded politely. But before the conversation could continue, the restaurant doors opened. At first no one paid attention, but then one of the investors glanced toward the entrance. His expression changed immediately. Benjamin noticed. "What is it?" he asked. The investor didn't answer. Instead, he stared toward the front of the restaurant. Benjamin turned his head, and for a moment, everything inside him froze, because standing just inside the entrance was Tiana. She wore a deep blue dress that moved gently as she walked. Her hand rested lightly against her stomach. She was pregnant, and beside her stood the one man Benjamin Caldwell hated more than anyone in Manhattan's business world. His rival, the entire restaurant seemed to notice at the same time. Forks paused in midair. Conversations faded. Benjamin felt the blood slowly drain from his face as Tiana began walking calmly toward the table, not angry, not emotional, just composed, like someone who had already finished thinking about everything that was about to happen. And suddenly Benjamin realized something terrifying. Tiana didn't come here to argue. She came here with a plan, and as she reached the edge of the table and met his eyes, Benjamin felt a question forming in his mind that he couldn't answer. What did she know that he didn't? Before we continue the story, I'm curious about something. If someone betrays their partner the way Benjamin betrayed Tiana, do you believe respect can ever return? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story so far, a like on the video helps more people discover stories like this. Welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. If you're new here, we're glad to have you. Subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling us the time and where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to the beginning of how this story really started, because the night Benjamin Caldwell's world collapsed actually began many years earlier. Long before Manhattan boardrooms ever learned her name, Tiana Carter understood something about the world that many powerful people spend their entire lives trying to figure out. Respect is not something you chase, it's something you carry. And the first place she learned that lesson was a modest apartment in Brooklyn. The building itself wasn't remarkable. 4 floors of aging brick, narrow hallways, and windows that rattled slightly when the subway passed several blocks away. On summer evenings, the street below filled with familiar sounds. Children racing bicycles along the pavement, neighbors calling out greetings from stoops, music drifting from open windows. For Tiana, those sounds weren't noise. They were rhythm. They were community. Sunday afternoons were the most important part of the week. The kitchen would fill with the smell of food long before anyone actually sat down to eat. Relatives arrived without calling first. Someone always brought extra dessert. Conversations overlapped loudly as people debated everything from sports to church gossip to neighborhood news. In that apartment, nobody cared about titles. Nobody cared about status. But people cared deeply about dignity. Tiana's father left for work early most mornings before the sun fully reached the tops of the buildings. Driving a city bus meant long hours and constant traffic, but he carried himself with a quiet pride that Tiana admired even as a child. He believed in showing up every day, doing the work, providing for your family. He didn't talk much about ambition. His lessons were quieter than that. Lessons about responsibility, consistency, standing tall, even when life didn't feel generous. Her mother worked in a hospital administration office downtown. Compared to her father's job, it seemed less physically demanding. But Tiana noticed something about her mother very early in life. She paid attention, not the kind of attention people give when they are trying to impress someone, but the kind that notices everything, who spoke respectfully, who treated others poorly when they thought no one was watching, who assumed certain people in the room mattered more than others. One evening when Tiana was still in high school, she asked her mother a question that had been sitting quietly in her mind. Why do some people act like they're better than everyone else? Her mother looked up from the paperwork she had brought home that night. Instead of answering immediately, she studied her daughter for a moment. Then she said something that would stay with Tiana for the rest of her life, because they confuse power with character. Tiana frowned slightly. What's the difference? Her mother leaned back in the chair. Power can be taken away, she explained calmly. Money disappears. Positions change. Titles move from one person to another. She tapped the table lightly with her finger. But character stays with you, no matter what room you walk into. Tiana absorbed the idea quietly. Her mother continued. Never chase power, she said. Build your life so power has to respect you. At the time, the sentence sounded simple, but over the years, it became a kind of compass for Tiana's decisions. School came naturally to her, not because she was obsessed with competition, but because she genuinely liked understanding how systems worked. Numbers made sense to her in ways that emotions sometimes didn't. By the time she reached college, finance had become the obvious direction. Money, investments, corporate structures, these were the invisible forces shaping entire cities. The people who understood those forces were the ones quietly steering enormous decisions. Tiana wanted to understand those systems and eventually influence them. Graduating with honors opened doors into Manhattan's corporate world, but stepping into those offices for the first time revealed something she had expected. She was often the only black woman in the room, sometimes the youngest person as well. During early meetings, executives occasionally made a subtle mistake that became almost predictable. They assumed she was there to take notes or assist someone more senior. Once, during a financial strategy meeting, an older executive handed her his empty coffee cup without even looking at her. Tiana accepted it politely. She walked to the side table, placed the cup down, then returned to her seat. A few minutes later, when the discussion turned toward a complicated investment projection, the same executive struggled to explain his calculations. Tiana waited patiently. Then she spoke. Your model assumes a 5% growth rate, she said calmly, but the market trend from the last quarter suggests closer to 3.2. The room grew quiet. She continued explaining the numbers clearly, walking through the math step by step. When she finished, the executive who had handed her the coffee cup stared at her for several seconds. That moment taught Tiana something valuable. Underestimation could be useful. When people assume you are less capable than you really are, they often reveal more than they should. They speak freely. They show their strategies. They let their guard down. Inside those Manhattan conference rooms, Tiana learned how to listen more than she spoke. She watched how deals were negotiated, how egos influenced decisions, how confidence sometimes hid uncertainty, and slowly, over time, the people who once overlooked her began realizing something uncomfortable. Tiana Carter was paying attention to everything. She wasn't loud. She didn't compete for attention. But when she spoke, the room listened. And somewhere inside Manhattan's fast-moving financial world, a reputation quietly began forming. Not the kind that appears in magazines, the more important kind, the kind powerful people share privately when they trust someone's judgment. Tiana Carter understood numbers, but more importantly, she understood people. What she didn't know yet was that one particular night in Midtown Manhattan would introduce her to a man whose ambition matched the size of the city itself, a man who believed power belonged to those who demanded it, Benjamin Caldwell. And that meeting would change the direction of both their lives in ways neither of them could see coming. Manhattan has a way of gathering ambition into the same room. Sometimes those rooms sit high above the city skyline. Other times they exist behind the polished doors of hotel ballrooms where expensive suits and evening gowns move through carefully arranged conversations. The night Benjamin Caldwell met Tiana Carter happened in one of those rooms. It was a charity gala held in Midtown, the kind of event that blended generosity with reputation. Wealthy donors attended partly to support a cause, and partly to be seen supporting it. Large banners displayed the organization's mission. Waiters moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. Near the bar stood Benjamin Caldwell. Even in a crowded ballroom, he was easy to notice. Tall, composed, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that looked effortless in the way expensive clothing often does. A glass of aged whiskey rested comfortably in his hand while he spoke with two investors about market trends and expansion strategies. Benjamin had already begun building a reputation in Manhattan's business world. His tech logistics company was attracting attention. Industry magazines had recently described it as one of the most promising young firms in the sector. Interviews with Benjamin often highlighted his confidence and his ability to see opportunities where others saw risk. He liked that reputation. More than that, he believed he had earned it. Growing up in an affluent suburb in Connecticut had shaped his understanding of success early. The rules there were clear: perform well in school, enter competitive industries, move quickly through professional ranks, and never show hesitation in front of rivals. Weakness invited competition. Confidence commanded respect. Benjamin had followed those rules precisely. Now at 34, he was exactly where he believed he should be, ascending. He lifted the whiskey glass slightly as one of the investors finished describing a potential partnership. That market will explode within 2 years, Benjamin said calmly. You're sure about that? The investor asked. Benjamin smiled. I don't invest in things I'm unsure about. The certainty in his voice was the kind that made people either admire him or quietly resent him. But that confidence had opened many doors, and tonight's gala had already provided several useful conversations. Still, Benjamin's attention began drifting away from the discussion. Across the ballroom, something had caught his eye. Near a quiet section of the room stood a woman he didn't recognize. She wasn't trying to draw attention to herself. In fact, she appeared more interested in observing the crowd than participating in it. A simple but elegant dress complemented her posture. The soft glow of the ballroom lighting reflected warmly against her brown skin. But what held Benjamin's attention wasn't her appearance alone. It was her composure. Most guests in the room carried a certain kind of energy. Subtle attempts to impress one another, conversations that felt slightly exaggerated, laughter that came a bit too quickly. The woman across the room seemed untouched by that atmosphere. She looked comfortable, as if she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. Benjamin excused himself from the investors. I'll catch up with you gentlemen later. With his whiskey glass still in hand, he walked across the ballroom toward her. Tiana noticed him approaching almost immediately. She had been watching the room carefully since arriving earlier that evening. Her colleague who invited her had spent most of the event speaking with donors, leaving Tiana free to observe the dynamics unfolding across the ballroom. Rooms like this fascinated her. The subtle hierarchy, the shifting alliances, the quiet competition beneath polite conversations. She had already noticed Benjamin earlier, the way people reacted to him, the way he spoke with certainty, the way attention naturally gathered around him. When he stopped beside her, she waited calmly. Benjamin nodded slightly. Enjoying the circus? Tiana raised an eyebrow. The circus? Benjamin gestured loosely around the ballroom. All these people pretending their donations are purely about generosity. His tone carried amusement rather than criticism. Tiana smiled faintly. That's a surprisingly honest observation from someone attending the event. Benjamin studied her face for a moment. You disagree? No, she said. I just find it interesting when someone admits it out loud. Benjamin chuckled quietly. That kind of honesty usually makes people uncomfortable. Tiana glanced across the ballroom. I've noticed. For several minutes, they stood there discussing the event, the city, and the strange social rituals that often surrounded wealth and philanthropy. Benjamin found himself enjoying the conversation more than he expected. Tiana didn't flatter him. She didn't appear impressed by his reputation. She simply responded with thoughtful observations that revealed a sharp understanding of the environment around them. Eventually, Benjamin asked the obvious question. So, what brought you here tonight? A colleague invited me, she said. You work in the nonprofit sector? Tiana shook her head slightly. Finance. Benjamin's interest sharpened. Really? Really? What kind of finance? Corporate analysis. Benjamin nodded slowly. That explains the way you watch the room. Tiana tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? You're studying everyone. She didn't deny it. I find people interesting. Benjamin smiled. So do I. Their conversation drifted into deeper territory after that. Benjamin spoke about growing up in Connecticut, where ambition was almost expected from childhood. Tiana described Brooklyn neighborhoods where community mattered as much as individual success. Two very different worlds. Yet something about that contrast made the conversation feel effortless. Benjamin admired her calm confidence. Tiana found his ambition intriguing. An hour passed before either of them noticed. When the charity organizers eventually invited guests toward the dining area, Benjamin realized something surprising. He didn't want the conversation to end. He glanced at Tiana. "Would you like to continue this discussion somewhere quieter sometime?" Tiana studied him for a moment. Then she smiled. Maybe. That single word carried enough curiosity to keep Benjamin thinking about her long after the gala ended. What neither of them realized that night was how deeply their lives were about to intertwine. Because attraction can begin with a simple conversation, but the consequences of that attraction sometimes take years to fully reveal themselves. And in Manhattan, where ambition often moves faster than wisdom, love can grow in ways that feel powerful in the beginning, even when the future quietly holds something very different. The weeks after the charity gala passed faster than either Benjamin Caldwell or Tiana Carter expected. What began as a simple conversation in a midtown ballroom turned into something that gradually threaded its way into both of their lives. Benjamin called her 2 days after the event, not with an elaborate invitation or a rehearsed speech, just a direct message. "Dinner this week?" Tiana smiled when she saw the message. She appreciated simplicity. Their first dinner together took place in a quiet Manhattan restaurant overlooking the East River. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the water, and the distant glow of bridges reflected across the dark surface. Benjamin arrived early. He always did. Preparation had been part of his personality, long before he ever ran a company. When Tiana entered the restaurant, he stood immediately, not because he believed in traditional gestures for appearance alone, but because something about her presence naturally demanded respect. The conversation that evening moved easily. Business, music, the strange contradictions that define New York City. Benjamin spoke openly about building his tech logistics company from the ground up. He described the early years when investors doubted his ideas and competitors tried to block his entry into the industry. Tiana listened carefully, not with exaggerated admiration, but with genuine curiosity. When she spoke about her own work in corporate finance, Benjamin quickly realized something important. Tiana wasn't simply intelligent. She was strategic. She understood financial structures in ways that impressed him almost immediately. Over the next several months, their relationship developed steadily. Benjamin introduced Tiana to the Manhattan lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. Elegant restaurants, where reservations required weeks of planning, private events hosted by investors, rooftop gatherings where the skyline stretched endlessly across the night. Tiana experienced all of it with interest, but never with the hunger Benjamin often saw in others who entered those spaces for the first time. She appreciated the beauty of those moments, but they didn't define her. In return, Tiana began introducing Benjamin to parts of the city he had rarely explored. Brooklyn became their weekend escape. Benjamin found himself walking through neighborhoods where brownstone buildings lined quiet streets and local restaurants served food that tasted far richer than many Manhattan establishments charging 3 times the price. Family cookouts brought another new experience. Benjamin had attended countless corporate gatherings where people spoke carefully and laughter stayed controlled. But Tiana's family gatherings felt different. Music played loudly. Relatives debated politics and sports with equal enthusiasm. Stories from childhood surfaced between bursts of laughter. Benjamin was surprised by how comfortable those gatherings made him feel. One evening after leaving a family dinner, he admitted something to Tiana as they walked along a quiet Brooklyn street. "Your family reminds me of something I didn't realize I missed." "What's that?" she asked. "People who say exactly what they mean." Tiana laughed softly. "That's Brooklyn." The relationship grew stronger with each passing season. 3 years later, Benjamin asked Tiana to marry him. The proposal took place during a quiet evening overlooking the Hudson River. The city lights reflected across the water, while boats moved slowly along the dark surface. Benjamin wasn't nervous, but he was serious. "I want to build a life with you," he told her. Tiana studied his face carefully. "What kind of life?" Benjamin answered without hesitation. "One where we both succeed." She smiled. "That's a good starting point." Their wedding brought together Two very different social circles. The ceremony took place on a rooftop venue overlooking the Hudson River, where the Manhattan skyline stretched across the horizon like a painting made of glass and steel. Benjamin's business colleagues arrived in tailored suits, exchanging polite greetings and discussing market trends while sipping champagne. Tiana's relatives brought something very different: energy, joy, music. Before the evening ended, those two worlds blended in a way few people expected. Executives who normally stayed composed found themselves laughing with Tiana's cousins. Benjamin watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He had built a company that was growing quickly, and now he had built a marriage that seemed just as promising. Early married life felt balanced. Tiana continued advancing in corporate finance, while Benjamin focused on expanding his company's reach across several new markets. Late evenings often ended with both of them sitting at their dining table reviewing business ideas or discussing industry trends. Benjamin admired her insight. Tiana appreciated his ambition. During their first year of marriage, Benjamin made a decision he described as both romantic and strategic. He transferred a significant portion of company shares into Tiana's name. At some point, he told her casually one evening, "This company is going to be worth far more than it is now." Tiana looked at the documents he placed on the table. "That's a generous gesture." Benjamin shrugged. "You're my wife." But the decision had deeper consequences than either of them fully considered at the time. Those shares gave Tiana something powerful: ownership, influence, authority within the company's structure. At that moment, however, none of it felt like leverage. It felt like trust. For a while, their life together looked almost ideal. Two ambitious professionals supporting each other. Two cultures blending into something unique. Two futures moving in the same direction. But success has a quiet way of reshaping people, especially in Manhattan. And over time, the version of Benjamin Caldwell that Tiana fell in love with would begin changing in ways that were almost invisible at first. Changes that would slowly turn admiration into distance, confidence into arrogance, and eventually, love into something far more complicated. Success rarely arrives loudly at first. Most of the time it appears gradually, disguised as opportunity. For Benjamin Caldwell, the shift began during the second year of his marriage to Tiana. His company had been growing steadily since its early launch, but something changed when several large contracts arrived within the same quarter. Suddenly, the small logistics platform he built years earlier was being discussed in serious financial circles. Investors began paying closer attention. Industry analysts mentioned the company during conferences. Business publications started describing it as one of the most promising technology-driven logistics firms operating in the northeastern market. Benjamin read every article. At first, he treated the coverage the way most entrepreneurs do, with cautious satisfaction. Recognition meant investors were watching. Investors watching meant capital would follow. But something interesting began happening after the third or fourth article appeared. Benjamin noticed the headlines were no longer just about the company. They were about him, Benjamin Caldwell, the vision behind the next generation of logistics. How one CEO is changing the way companies move goods across cities. Photographs of Benjamin began appearing beside those headlines. Perfectly framed portraits, arms folded confidently, eyes focused forward. When the first interview request came from a financial podcast, Benjamin accepted immediately. The recording took place in a sleek Manhattan studio filled with soft lighting and microphones positioned carefully around a circular table. The host greeted him warmly. "Benjamin Caldwell has built one of the fastest-growing logistics platforms in the industry," the host announced as the recording began. "Today we're talking with the man behind that success." Benjamin leaned comfortably toward the microphone. He had always been articulate in meetings, but something about speaking to a larger audience energized him even more. Questions flowed easily. How did he identify the opportunity? What risks did he take early in the company's development? What advice would he give young entrepreneurs? Benjamin answered with confidence, explaining his strategy and describing the future he envisioned for the industry. By the time the episode was published, the response surprised even him. Thousands of listeners, messages from aspiring founders, investors requesting meetings, and invitations to speak at business panels. One interview turned into 3 more, then conference invitations, then networking events where people approached him before he even introduced himself. "Benjamin Caldwell, right? I listened to your interview last week." He smiled politely each time. Recognition became normal. At first, Tiana watched these developments with genuine pride. She had always admired Benjamin's ambition. He worked relentlessly during the company's early years. Long nights studying market trends, negotiating partnerships, solving logistical problems that threatened to stall operations. Seeing his work recognized felt deserved. One evening, after returning from another interview recording, Benjamin walked into their apartment carrying a printed copy of a business magazine. He placed it on the kitchen counter, where Tiana was reviewing financial reports. "Look at this," he said. Tiana glanced up. On the cover was Benjamin's photograph. Below it ran a bold headline about innovation and leadership. She smiled. "That's impressive." Benjamin leaned against the counter. "It's just the beginning." Tiana studied the article carefully. The writer described Benjamin as confident, decisive, and unafraid of risk. Those qualities had always been part of him. But as the weeks passed, something subtle began changing. Recognition started arriving faster than reflection. Compliments from investors, praise during panel discussions, messages from strangers describing him as visionary. Admiration can feel intoxicating when it appears often enough. Benjamin found himself seeking it more frequently. He accepted invitations to speak at events that had little to do with logistics simply because audiences were eager to hear him talk about success. He enjoyed walking into rooms where people already knew his name. And gradually, the version of Benjamin that appeared in magazine articles began shaping the way he saw himself. The confident entrepreneur slowly became something larger in his own mind. A man whose instincts were always correct. A man whose decisions rarely required second opinions. At home, the shift appeared in small moments. During conversations about the company, Benjamin began speaking more than he listened. When Tiana offered analytical observations about certain financial patterns, he sometimes waved them away casually. "Relax," he would say. "I've already thought through that." The tone wasn't cruel, but it carried a new kind of certainty. The certainty of someone who had started believing his own reputation. One night after attending a business panel where the audience applauded loudly after his speech, Benjamin returned home energized. "They loved it," he said while loosening his tie. Tiana smiled gently. "That's good." Benjamin continued pacing across the living room. "You should have heard the questions they were asking. People want to know how I see the future of this industry." Tiana looked up from the financial model she had been reviewing. "And what did you tell them?" Benjamin stopped walking. "That we're about to dominate it." The confidence in his voice filled the room. Tiana nodded slowly. She believed in the company too, but something in Benjamin's tone felt different now. Less thoughtful, more absolute. Success had begun changing the way he measured himself. And while Benjamin still believed he was simply becoming stronger, the truth was more complicated. Because admiration can quietly distort a person's perspective. And the man who once valued Tiana's insight more than anyone else's was beginning to believe something dangerous, that he no longer needed it. The shift in Benjamin Caldwell's behavior did not happen all at once. It began with small adjustments that, at first, looked like nothing more than the natural demands of a growing company. More meetings, more travel, more invitations to investor gatherings where opportunities were discussed long after midnight. At the beginning, Tiana understood. Building a company required attention. She had spent enough time studying corporate growth cycles to know that certain phases demanded intense focus. When Benjamin texted her that he would be late because a meeting had run longer than expected, she believed him. Sometimes it was true, but over time, the late evenings became more frequent. Then came the cancellations. One Friday night, Tiana had reservations at a quiet restaurant in Brooklyn where they had celebrated their anniversary the year before. The place meant something to her because it reminded her of the early days when their relationship still felt balanced between two worlds. Benjamin was supposed to meet her there at 7. At 6:45, her phone buzzed. Running late. Investor dinner came up. Tiana stared at the message for a moment. She typed back calmly, "Another night?" The reply came quickly. "Let's reschedule." She sat in the restaurant anyway, not out of stubbornness, just because she was already there. The waiter approached politely. "Will someone be joining you?" "Not tonight," she said with a small smile. Moments like that didn't seem significant on their own, but the pattern continued. A dinner canceled here, a weekend meeting scheduled there. Gradually, evenings that once belonged to their relationship began filling with investor gatherings and networking events. Benjamin described these events with excitement when he returned home. "You wouldn't believe the connections I'm making," he said one night while removing his jacket. "Some of these people control enormous capital." Tiana listened patiently. "That's good for the company." Benjamin poured himself a drink. "It's good for everything." The apartment grew quieter after statements like that. Not tense, just quieter. Another change appeared in Benjamin's conversations about business strategy. Early in their marriage, he often asked Tiana for her thoughts on financial planning. She had helped analyze market trends and evaluate potential risks in certain partnerships. Now, those discussions became shorter. One evening, Tiana was reviewing the company's quarterly financial projections on her laptop when she noticed something unusual. A series of large transfers had moved into several high-risk investment positions. Not the kind of positions normally associated with stable logistics operations. She waited until Benjamin returned home before mentioning it. "I was reviewing the latest numbers," she said carefully. Benjamin loosened his tie while walking toward the kitchen. "Everything looked good?" "Mostly," she replied. He opened the refrigerator. "Mostly." Tiana turned the laptop slightly so he could see the screen. "These trades are unusual for this kind of company structure." Benjamin glanced at the numbers briefly. "They're short-term opportunities. They're also extremely volatile," she said calmly. Benjamin shrugged. "Volatility is where the real money is." Tiana closed the laptop gently. "Risk is different from volatility." Benjamin poured water into a glass. "You worry too much." The words were spoken casually, but they lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. Tiana studied his face. "I'm not worrying," she said. "I'm analyzing." Benjamin took a sip from the glass. "Well, analysis doesn't build companies." The sentence carried a tone she had never heard from him before. Dismissive. It surprised her enough that she didn't answer immediately. Benjamin noticed the silence, but didn't address it. Instead, he moved on to another topic. "I've been invited to another investor gathering tomorrow night," he said. "Some interesting people will be there." "Tomorrow?" Tiana asked. He nodded. "We had plans." Benjamin paused briefly, as if trying to remember. "Oh, right." He waved his hand lightly. "We can do something next week." Tiana didn't argue, but she felt something shifting beneath the surface of their relationship. The balance that once existed between them was beginning to tilt. Benjamin's attention was now almost completely focused on expansion, influence, and recognition within business circles. Investor gatherings became regular occurrences. Private parties hosted in penthouse apartments where conversations about market domination flowed as easily as expensive whiskey. Benjamin thrived in those environments. People listened when he spoke. They laughed at his jokes. They admired his confidence. The admiration fueled something inside him that was growing stronger with every passing month. Meanwhile, the financial decisions he made for the company were becoming increasingly aggressive. Large investments moved quickly through complex trading channels. Benjamin described them as strategic. Tiana saw something else: exposure. One night she sat alone at the dining table reviewing updated financial reports while Benjamin attended yet another investor event downtown. The numbers told a story he wasn't acknowledging. Short-term gains were masking deeper instability. Debt was increasing faster than revenue. The structure of the company was beginning to depend on constant wins in volatile markets. And volatile markets rarely stay friendly forever. When Benjamin returned home close to midnight, he looked energized. "Great evening," he said, as he placed his keys on the table. Tiana closed the financial report slowly. "We need to talk about the company." Benjamin sighed quietly. "Not tonight." But Tiana could already see something he hadn't realized yet. The first cracks in success often appear long before anyone else notices them. And Benjamin Caldwell had started making decisions that would eventually lead him toward a moment he would never forget. The only question now was how long it would take for reality to catch up with his confidence. By the time the argument finally happened, the tension had already been building for months. Not through shouting, not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet distance. The kind that forms when two people who once moved in the same direction slowly begin walking along different paths. For a while, Tiana tried to convince herself the situation would stabilize. Businesses often go through demanding periods. She had seen it many times while working in corporate finance. Founders sometimes became consumed by expansion phases before eventually rediscovering balance. But the numbers she was studying told a different story. Benjamin's investment decisions were becoming more aggressive with every passing quarter. The company's internal structure was shifting in ways that made her uneasy. Short-term profits were masking deeper instability. Debt levels were climbing, and the most concerning part wasn't the risk itself. It was Benjamin's growing refusal to discuss it. One evening, the situation reached a point where silence no longer felt responsible. The apartment was unusually quiet that night. Benjamin had returned home earlier than usual after canceling an investor gathering at the last minute. He sat on the living room couch scrolling through emails on his phone, while a glass of whiskey rested on the table beside him. Tiana stood near the dining table holding several printed financial reports. She had reviewed them twice already. The conclusion was unavoidable. "Benjamin," she said calmly. He didn't look up immediately. We need to talk about the company." Benjamin sighed softly, still focused on his phone. "We've talked about this already." "No," she replied quietly. "You talked." "I listened." He glanced up at her now. "What's that supposed to mean?" Tiana walked toward the coffee table and placed the reports in front of him. "These trades are getting larger." Benjamin leaned back slightly. "They're profitable. For now." He picked up one of the pages and glanced at it. "Risk is part of growth." "Yes," Tiana agreed. "But this isn't strategic expansion anymore." Benjamin placed the paper down. "It's exactly that." Tiana folded her arms gently. "Benjamin, you're using company funds for positions that could collapse overnight." He stared at her. "You sound like a risk analyst who's afraid of opportunity." Her expression didn't change. "I sound like someone who understands financial exposure." Benjamin leaned forward now, irritation beginning to show in his voice. "You think I don't understand my own company?" "That's not what I said." "Then what exactly are you saying?" Tiana kept her voice steady. "I'm saying the numbers don't support the level of risk you're taking." Benjamin let out a short laugh. "You worry too much." She had heard that sentence before, but this time she didn't let it pass. "This isn't about worry," she said. "It's about responsibility." Benjamin stood up from the couch. "For months you've been questioning every move I make. I've been analyzing them." He shook his head. "You're treating this company like a classroom exercise." The comment surprised her. "You asked for my insight when we started building this. That was different." "How?" Benjamin ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "Because back then, the company was small." Tiana stared at him. "And now the stakes are bigger." She nodded slowly. "Exactly. That's why I need you to trust me." Tiana's eyes moved briefly toward the financial reports, still sitting on the table. "Trust requires transparency." Benjamin's patience finally snapped. "You know what the real problem is?" Tiana looked at him calmly. "What?" "You don't understand the level I'm operating on now." The sentence landed heavier than he expected, but he continued speaking. "You're good with numbers. I'll give you that." The phrase felt strangely formal coming from her husband, but running a company at this scale requires instincts you don't have. Tiana felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent years earning respect in financial environments where people underestimated her abilities. Hearing something similar from Benjamin felt different, more personal. "Instincts don't replace discipline," she replied quietly. Benjamin laughed again, though there was no humor in the sound. "This is exactly what I mean." "What do you mean?" "You're always analyzing, questioning, calculating. That's called responsible leadership." Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that would echo through both of their lives long after that night ended. "You were never really my type anyway." The room went completely silent. Tiana didn't move. Benjamin seemed almost unaware of what he had just said. He continued speaking, his voice filled with frustration. "You're strong, independent, analytical." He gestured toward the financial papers. "But that's not really the kind of woman who fits the life I'm building now." The words hung in the air like a door closing. Tiana felt the weight of them settle slowly inside her. Not explosive anger, not tears, just clarity. For years she had believed Benjamin respected her mind as much as her presence, that they were building something together. But in that moment, she understood something important. Benjamin didn't see her as a partner anymore. He saw her as an obstacle. She looked at him quietly for several seconds. Benjamin shifted slightly under the silence, but didn't apologize. The arrogance that had grown inside him during the past year kept him from recognizing what he had just destroyed. Finally, Tiana spoke. Her voice was calm. "You should get some rest." Benjamin frowned. "That's it?" "Yes. You're not going to argue." Tiana shook her head. "No, because arguing would suggest the relationship still rested on mutual respect." And the moment Benjamin spoke those words, that foundation had already disappeared. She picked up the financial reports from the table. Then she walked toward the bedroom without another sentence. Benjamin remained standing in the living room, slightly confused by her reaction. He had expected anger, a confrontation, something emotional. Instead, he received silence. What he didn't understand was that silence sometimes means something far more dangerous. It means someone has stopped trying to convince you, and somewhere deep inside Tiana Carter, a quiet decision had just been made. She would never beg for respect, but she would remember exactly who Benjamin Caldwell had chosen to become. The silence that followed Benjamin Caldwell's words lasted longer than he realized. When Tiana walked into the bedroom that night carrying the financial reports, she did not slam the door. She did not cry. She did not send angry messages to friends or family. Instead, she placed the papers carefully on the desk beside the window. Then she sat down. Outside, Manhattan continued moving with its usual restless energy. Cars passed along the street below. Lights glowed from hundreds of apartment windows across neighboring buildings. Inside the room, the only sound came from the quiet turning of pages. Tiana began reviewing the numbers again, not because she doubted what she had already seen, but because clarity mattered. Financial records have a way of revealing truths that people try to hide. Every transfer leaves a trail. Every decision creates patterns. Benjamin believed he was taking bold risks, but bold risks always leave fingerprints. She opened the first quarterly report. Revenue growth remained strong. That part of the company still looked impressive on the surface. Contracts with distribution partners had increased. Expansion into new delivery networks had produced short bursts of profit. But when she moved deeper into the financial structure, a different picture appeared. Large sums had been redirected into external investment channels. The amounts increased each quarter. At first, the trades appeared small enough to overlook. Then, they grew larger and larger. Tiana opened another spreadsheet. Her eyes moved slowly across the columns. The trades were not connected to the company's logistics operations. They were speculative market positions, currency movements, short-term commodities, aggressive leverage trades designed to produce fast returns. This was not corporate strategy. This was gambling. She leaned back slightly in the chair. Benjamin had always been confident, but he had never been careless with money during the early years of the company. In fact, his cautious financial discipline was one of the reasons she respected him when they first met. That discipline had disappeared. Another file revealed something even more concerning. Benjamin had begun covering earlier losses by increasing the size of new trades, which meant the entire financial structure was becoming dependent on constant wins. If the market turned even slightly against him, the damage would multiply quickly. Tiana closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened another report. This one showed company debt. Several lines of credit had been expanded quietly. The borrowed funds had flowed directly into those speculative positions. Her fingers rested on the edge of the desk. Millions of dollars, not invested, wagered. Benjamin had convinced himself he could outmaneuver the markets, and for a while, he had been lucky. But luck has limits. She opened the final document. The timeline stretched across several months. Losses had already begun appearing, not catastrophic ones yet, but large enough that Benjamin had clearly been trying to recover them with even bigger risks. Tiana understood the pattern immediately. She had studied enough financial collapses to recognize it. First comes overconfidence, then aggressive expansion, then the attempt to recover losses through even greater exposure. The cycle ends the same way, almost every time. Eventually, the numbers stop cooperating. She looked toward the living room, where Benjamin was still awake. The sound of a television echoed faintly through the apartment. For a moment she remembered the man she met years earlier at that charity gala. Ambitious, confident, but disciplined. That version of Benjamin would never have risked an entire company on unstable trades. Success had changed him more than either of them realized. Tiana turned back to the desk. Her mind was no longer focused on the argument they had just had. The emotional wound remained, but something else had taken priority: reality. Employees depended on the company. Investors trusted its leadership, and Benjamin was quietly steering everything toward disaster. Another thought settled into place slowly. She was not just Benjamin's wife. She was also the company's majority shareholder. When Benjamin transferred those shares during their first year of marriage, he described the gesture as romantic. But the legal structure behind those documents was very real. Ownership carried authority, and authority created options. Tiana opened a new folder on the computer. Inside it, she began organizing the financial evidence she had discovered. Every trade, every debt expansion, every unexplained loss. The work continued for hours. When she finally looked up from the screen, the sky outside had begun turning gray with early morning light. Benjamin had fallen asleep on the couch. Tiana closed the laptop quietly. Then she sat still for a moment. The situation was now clear. Benjamin's company was heading toward collapse, but collapse was not inevitable, because knowledge creates leverage. And Tiana Carter had just learned exactly how dangerous Benjamin Caldwell's decisions had become. What she needed now was the right person to help her act before everything fell apart. The morning after Tiana finished reviewing the company's financial records, Manhattan looked exactly the way it always did. Busy, unbothered. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Taxi drivers leaned on their horns as traffic crawled through intersections. Office towers filled slowly as another workday began. Nothing about the city suggested that Benjamin Caldwell's company was quietly standing on the edge of disaster. Tiana sat inside a small midtown cafe near the financial district. She chose the location carefully. Not flashy, not crowded with industry insiders, just quiet enough for a private conversation. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her while a tablet rested beside it. The tablet contained copies of the financial evidence she had organized overnight. The numbers told a clear story. Now she needed someone capable of understanding what those numbers meant. Benjamin's rival arrived 10 minutes later. He stepped inside the cafe wearing a dark overcoat, his expression calm and observant as his eyes quickly scanned the room. When he spotted Tiana, he walked toward her table without hesitation. They had met briefly before at industry events, but never in a setting like this. He pulled out the chair across from her. "I wasn't expecting your message," he said. Tiana nodded politely. "I imagine not." A server approached, but he waved politely. "Just water." The server left. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Benjamin's rival studied her carefully. "Usually when someone asks to meet this early in the morning," he said calmly, "it means something important is happening." Tiana slid the tablet across the table. "Look at these." He glanced down at the screen. At first his expression remained neutral. Then he began scrolling through the documents. One page, then another, then another. His posture slowly shifted forward. "These are company records," he said. "Yes, recent ones. Very." He continued reading quietly. The cafe around them filled with normal morning conversation, but their table felt strangely separate from the rest of the room. Finally, he looked up. "Benjamin is making extremely aggressive trades. That's one way to describe it." He returned his attention to the tablet. "These positions are highly leveraged." "Yes, and they're not connected to the company's core operations." "No." His eyes narrowed slightly. "He's using company funds." "Yes." He leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. For years, he and Benjamin Caldwell had competed in the same business space. Their companies chased similar contracts and often appeared in the same financial conversations. The rivalry had grown intense over time. Benjamin enjoyed dismissing his competitors publicly, and Benjamin's rival had never forgotten those moments. But what he saw in front of him now wasn't simply a competitor making risky moves. It was something far more dangerous. "This exposure is enormous," he said quietly. Tiana nodded. "He's already lost millions trying to recover earlier losses." Benjamin's rival tapped the screen lightly. "If the market turns against these positions, the company collapses." He studied her face carefully. "You're aware that giving me this information could destroy him." Tiana's expression remained steady. "I'm aware of the facts." He watched her for another moment. "You're still married to him." "Yes. So why show me this?" Tiana rested her hands on the table. "Because the company employs hundreds of people." He nodded slowly. And you believe Benjamin is about to lose it all. I don't believe, she said. I know. The rival looked down again at the documents. His mind was already calculating possibilities. Market position, asset value, contract networks. Benjamin Caldwell's company still held significant operational infrastructure, despite the financial instability hiding beneath it, which meant something interesting. If the company collapses, he said slowly, the assets will be liquidated cheaply. Yes, and whoever moves first could acquire them. Tiana didn't respond, but her silence answered the question. He placed the tablet back on the table. You're suggesting an acquisition. I'm suggesting stability. He smiled faintly. That's a very diplomatic way of describing a takeover. Tiana remained calm. Employees keep their jobs. Investors recover their money. And Benjamin? Tiana looked toward the window for a moment before answering. Benjamin made his decisions. The rival leaned back slightly. You realize how ironic this is. How so? For years, Benjamin treated our competition like a personal battle. Tiana said nothing, and now the person who might hand me his company is his own wife. She met his eyes calmly. I'm the majority shareholder. That statement changed the tone of the conversation immediately. Benjamin's rival understood corporate structures well enough to know exactly what that meant. Majority, 60%. He let out a quiet breath. Well, he folded his hands on the table. That changes everything. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, he said something carefully. You didn't contact me because you want revenge. No, you contacted me because you want control over what happens next. Yes. The rival smiled slightly. Now that, I respect. He stood up slowly. I'll review these numbers with my analysts. Tiana nodded. If the situation is as unstable as it appears. He finished the sentence calmly. Then, we may have an opportunity. As he walked toward the cafe exit, he paused briefly beside her table. One question. Tiana looked up. Does Benjamin realize how close he is to losing everything? She shook her head. No. The rival nodded thoughtfully. That will make this much easier. Then he left the cafe. Tiana remained seated for several minutes after he was gone. Outside the window, Manhattan continued moving like nothing unusual had happened. But beneath the surface of that ordinary morning, something important had just begun. Because once the right people understand the truth behind a company's finances, the future can change very quickly. And Benjamin Caldwell still had no idea that the ground beneath his empire had already started shifting. After the meeting in Midtown, Tiana Carter did not rush into action. That had never been her style. Quick decisions can feel satisfying in the moment, but strategy requires patience. The situation she was dealing with was far too serious for emotional reactions. Benjamin Caldwell still believed he was in control of everything. That illusion gave her time. For the next several days, Tiana focused on preparation. The first step was understanding the full extent of her authority. Late one evening, she sat in the quiet office of their Manhattan apartment, with several legal documents spread across the desk. The papers Benjamin had once signed casually, transferring company shares into her name, now carried far more weight than he ever imagined. At the time, he had described the move as romantic, a gesture of trust. But corporate law does not operate on sentiment. Ownership determines control, and the documents confirmed exactly what she already suspected. Tiana Carter held 60% of the company's shares, majority ownership. That meant the power to influence major decisions, including the sale of the company itself. Benjamin had always assumed the shares were symbolic. He never imagined she would one day need to exercise that authority. Tiana closed the folder slowly. The legal framework was clear, but legal authority alone would not be enough. Investors needed to understand the reality of the situation before any transition could occur. So the next phase required careful conversations, not dramatic confrontations, quiet discussions. Over the following weeks, Tiana began reaching out to several of the company's major investors. She chose her words carefully in each conversation. She did not accuse Benjamin of incompetence. She did not criticize his leadership directly. Instead, she asked questions. Have you reviewed the most recent financial projections? Do the trading patterns concern you? Have you noticed the increasing debt exposure? At first, most of the investors responded cautiously. Benjamin Caldwell still carried a strong reputation in Manhattan's business circles. His confidence had convinced many people that the company's aggressive growth strategy was part of a larger plan, but numbers are difficult to ignore when someone points directly at them. During one private meeting in a conference room downtown, Tiana placed several financial summaries on the table for two investors who had supported the company since its early stages. One of them leaned forward to study the documents. "These positions are unusually risky," he said. Tiana nodded. "They are." The second investor frowned slightly. "Benjamin didn't mention any of this during our last meeting." Tiana remained calm. "That's why I wanted to speak with you privately." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, one of them asked the obvious question, "How serious is the situation?" Tiana answered honestly, "If the markets move against these trades, the company could collapse." The words carried weight. Investors understand risk, but they also understand when risk crosses into recklessness. Over time, similar conversations took place with several others. The reaction was always the same: concern, followed by careful silence, and eventually, agreement. Benjamin Caldwell's strategy was no longer defensible. Meanwhile, Benjamin continued operating exactly as he always had. Investor dinners, industry events, interviews with financial publications. He still believed the company was on the verge of dominating its market. He had no idea that several of the same investors applauding his presentations were now quietly reviewing the financial evidence Tiana had gathered. The final stage of preparation happened during another private meeting with Benjamin's rival. This time the setting was an office overlooking the Hudson River. The rival stood near the window when Tiana entered. He turned as she approached the desk. "My analysts confirmed everything," he said. Tiana nodded. "I expected they would." He placed several documents on the desk. "Benjamin's company still has valuable infrastructure, contracts, technology, distribution networks, but the financial structure supporting it is unstable." "Exactly." He tapped the papers lightly. "Which means if the situation continues much longer, the collapse will destroy most of the company's value." Tiana looked at the documents. "And if it happens soon, then the company can still be saved." The rival leaned forward slightly. "Through acquisition." Tiana remained quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "Can you protect the employees?" "Yes." "Maintain the existing operations?" "Yes." "Honor the investors' positions?" "Yes." He paused before adding one more sentence. "But Benjamin loses control." Tiana already understood that part. The company had reached a point where leadership could no longer remain in the hands of someone gambling with its future. "What happens next?" she asked. The rival smiled slightly. "We wait." "For what?" "For Benjamin to create the perfect moment." Tiana raised an eyebrow. "What kind of moment?" "A public one." He tapped the documents again. "Something that gathers investors in one place. Somewhere the truth can't be ignored." Tiana understood immediately. Benjamin loved investor dinners. He often organized them in high-end restaurants where he could present new expansion plans. The rival continued speaking. "When that moment comes, we present the financial reality and the acquisition offer." Tiana looked out the window toward the river. Benjamin believed he was controlling the narrative of his success, but the truth was already moving quietly beneath the surface. "Then we move quickly," the rival said. "Yes." The plan was simple, clear, and unavoidable. All that remained now was timing. And in Manhattan, timing often decides who rises and who falls. Benjamin Caldwell was still walking confidently through boardrooms and investor gatherings, convinced his reputation remained untouchable. But somewhere in the city, the pieces of a very different future had already fallen into place. And when the moment finally arrived, the truth would be waiting for him at the table. On the evening Benjamin Caldwell believed he was reclaiming control of his life, Manhattan glittered exactly the way he liked it. Cold winter air moved between the towers of Midtown, while headlights flowed along the avenues in steady streams. Restaurants filled with evening guests. Offices emptied slowly as the city shifted from business hours into nightlife. Benjamin sat comfortably in the back seat of a black town car as it moved through traffic. Across from him sat the woman who had recently become a regular part of his public appearances. Her black dress reflected the passing streetlights softly as the car moved between intersections. She adjusted the sleeve of her coat while studying Benjamin with quiet curiosity. "You seem confident tonight," she said. Benjamin smiled faintly. "Confidence is useful." The car turned onto the avenue where the restaurant waited near the corner. Benjamin glanced out the window. He had chosen this location carefully. The steakhouse was one of Manhattan's most respected dining establishments. Executives from major investment firms often met there. Private rooms in the back hosted negotiations worth millions. More importantly, the restaurant had a reputation for discretion, perfect for investor gatherings. Tonight's dinner had one purpose: control. The past few months had brought whispers among some investors about market volatility and unusual financial positioning. Benjamin knew those conversations were happening, even if no one addressed them directly. That was why tonight mattered. He intended to remind everyone exactly who was leading the company. The car slowed as it approached the entrance. A doorman opened the door before the vehicle even stopped moving. Benjamin stepped onto the sidewalk and adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. The woman joined him moments later, sliding her arm lightly through his. "Ready?" she asked. Benjamin glanced toward the glowing restaurant entrance. Always. Inside, the atmosphere carried the quiet elegance expected in places where wealth gathers comfortably. Low lighting reflected off polished wooden walls. Crystal glasses waited on linen-covered tables. The scent of grilled steak and aged wine floated softly through the room. A host greeted Benjamin immediately. "Mr. Caldwell, your table is ready." Benjamin nodded. "Thank you." They walked toward the private dining area in the back. Several investors were already seated around the long table when Benjamin arrived. The men stood as he approached. Handshakes followed. Firm, professional, but something subtle had changed. Benjamin noticed it immediately. The smiles were polite. The conversation slightly cautious. Investors who once greeted him with easy enthusiasm now studied him more carefully. Benjamin ignored the shift. Confidence meant acting as if nothing had changed. He took the seat at the head of the table and gestured toward the empty chair beside him. "My guest for the evening," he said casually. The woman smiled politely as she sat. One of the investors leaned forward slightly. "We heard there have been personal developments recently." Benjamin lifted his wine glass. "Yes," he said calmly. "My marriage is coming to an end." The words moved quietly across the table. No one reacted dramatically, but several investors exchanged brief glances. Benjamin continued speaking. "Sometimes people grow in different directions." He placed his hand lightly over the woman's. "And sometimes life presents new opportunities." The statement carried an unspoken message. Benjamin Caldwell was still successful, still admired, still moving forward. The investors nodded politely, but the tension beneath the table remained. Benjamin leaned back comfortably. "Now," he said, smiling confidently, "let's talk about the future of this company." At that moment, Benjamin believed he was controlling the narrative of the evening. He believed the room still belonged to him. He believed admiration still surrounded him the way it had for years. What he didn't know was that several of the same investors sitting across from him had already reviewed the financial documents Tiana Carter quietly shared weeks earlier. They were no longer attending this dinner to celebrate success. They were waiting to see what Benjamin Caldwell would say next, and waiting for something else, something Benjamin could never have predicted, because somewhere outside the restaurant doors, the final piece of the evening's plan had just arrived. Benjamin Caldwell was halfway through explaining a new expansion strategy when the first subtle shift in the room occurred. At the far end of the table, one of the investors glanced toward the restaurant entrance. His expression changed. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight pause in his attention. Benjamin noticed it immediately. A man who had spent years reading rooms for opportunity rarely missed small signals like that. "Something wrong?" Benjamin asked casually. The investor didn't answer right away. Instead, he continued looking toward the front of the restaurant. Another investor turned his head as well. Then another. Within seconds, the quiet focus around the table began drifting toward the entrance. Benjamin followed their gaze. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Guests moved through the restaurant as they always did. Waiters carried trays between tables. Conversations blended together into a low hum of evening activity. Then the front door opened again, and Benjamin saw her, Tiana Carter stepped inside the restaurant with the calm confidence of someone who understood exactly where she was going. The lighting inside the room reflected softly against her deep blue dress as she paused briefly near the entrance. Her hand rested gently against her stomach. The pregnancy was unmistakable now. Benjamin's chest tightened. For a moment, he simply stared. The room seemed to shrink around him. But what made the moment even more unsettling was the man standing beside her. Benjamin's rival. The two men had spent years competing for contracts, clients, and influence within the same industry. Benjamin had publicly dismissed him more than once, in interviews, at conferences, in conversations with investors. Seeing him standing beside Tiana felt like something impossible. The rival stood calmly, his expression composed as he looked across the restaurant. Then his eyes met Benjamin's. No hostility, no triumph, just quiet recognition. Around the dining table, the investors had stopped pretending to focus on their menus. Several of them leaned slightly forward. They understood the significance of what they were seeing. Benjamin slowly placed his wine glass down on the table. The faint sound of crystal touching wood seemed unusually loud. "What is she doing here?" he muttered under his breath. Beside him, the woman he had brought to the dinner followed the direction of everyone's attention. "Benjamin," she whispered, "is that your wife?" Benjamin didn't answer, because at that moment, Tiana had begun walking across the restaurant. Her steps were steady, unhurried. Every movement carried the quiet control of someone who had already thought through the next several minutes. The rival walked beside her without speaking. The entire restaurant seemed to notice the scene unfolding. Nearby conversations slowed. Forks paused mid-air. Even the waiters moved more carefully as the two figures approached the private dining area. Benjamin felt heat rising behind his eyes. Anger, confusion, and something else he didn't want to name. Because Tiana didn't look angry. She didn't look emotional. She looked certain. That calmness unsettled him more than any confrontation would have. By the time she reached the edge of the private dining section, the investors had turned fully in their seats. One of them cleared his throat quietly. Benjamin stood up slowly. "What are you doing here?" he asked. His voice remained controlled, but the tension underneath it was obvious. Tiana met his eyes. "Good evening, Benjamin." Her tone was polite, almost professional. Benjamin's jaw tightened. "This is a private dinner." "Yes," she said calmly. "I know." Her gaze shifted briefly across the table, acknowledging the investors seated there. "Good evening, gentlemen." Several of them nodded awkwardly. They recognized her, not just as Benjamin's wife, but as someone who held significant influence within the company's ownership structure. Benjamin's rival stepped forward slightly. Benjamin looked directly at him. "You've got some nerve showing up here." The rival remained relaxed. "I wasn't invited." Benjamin let out a short laugh. "That's obvious." The woman sitting beside Benjamin leaned slightly away from the tension building near the table. "What is happening?" she whispered quietly. Benjamin ignored the question. His attention remained locked on Tiana. "You should leave," he said. Tiana tilted her head slightly. "Why?" "Because this conversation doesn't concern you." For the first time since entering the restaurant, a faint expression of curiosity crossed her face. "Doesn't concern me?" Benjamin gestured toward the table. "This is business." Tiana glanced down at the empty chairs near the end of the table. Then she looked back at him. "That's exactly why I'm here." Before Benjamin could respond, she stepped forward and pulled out one of the chairs. The soft scrape of the chair legs across the floor echoed through the suddenly silent room. Then she sat down. Benjamin's rival calmly took the seat beside her. The investors exchanged uneasy looks. Because the dinner Benjamin Caldwell believed would reinforce his authority had suddenly transformed into something very different. Benjamin remained standing for several seconds, trying to understand what he was looking at. Tiana folded her hands gently on the table. "Please," she said softly. "Continue." Benjamin stared at her. "You think this is funny?" "No." The calm answer only made the moment heavier. For years, Benjamin had controlled every room he entered. Tonight, that control was slipping away, and he could feel it happening in real time. The investors were no longer looking at him with admiration. They were watching him with curiosity, waiting, because everyone in that room sensed the same thing. Something important was about to be revealed, and Benjamin Caldwell had no idea what it was. Benjamin Caldwell slowly lowered himself back into his chair. For the first time that evening, The confidence he had carried into the restaurant felt slightly unstable. Across the table, Tiana sat calmly beside his rival. Her posture relaxed as if she had simply joined an ordinary business meeting, but nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Benjamin looked directly at her. "You're making a scene." Tiana's voice remained steady. "No, Benjamin." Her eyes briefly moved across the investors seated around the table. "I'm preventing one." Several of the investors shifted in their seats. The tension was no longer subtle. Benjamin leaned forward. "If you have something to say, say it." Tiana nodded slightly. "That's exactly why I came." Beside her, Benjamin's rival reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. He placed it gently on the table. The sound of paper touching wood seemed unusually loud in the silent room. Benjamin stared at the folder. "What is that?" The rival slid it toward the center of the table. "Financial records." Benjamin scoffed. "My company has an entire accounting department for that." "Yes," the rival replied calmly, "but they aren't the documents your investors have been seeing." The statement pulled immediate attention from everyone at the table. One of the investors leaned forward. "What does that mean?" Tiana answered before Benjamin could speak. "It means the company's public reports don't reflect the full picture." Benjamin's jaw tightened. "That's not true." Tiana opened the folder. Inside were printed reports, pages of financial summaries, trading positions, debt structures, the same documents she had spent nights analyzing. She turned the folder so the investors could see. "These are the internal trading records from the past 12 months. One investor picked up the first page. His eyes moved quickly across the numbers. His expression changed almost immediately. "This can't be correct." Benjamin leaned forward sharply. "Those documents are taken out of context." Another investor grabbed a second sheet. "Benjamin, these are highly leveraged positions. They're strategic investments. They're gambling." The investor replied quietly. The word hung in the air. Gambling. Benjamin's voice rose slightly. "You don't understand the strategy behind them." Tiana finally looked directly at him. "Benjamin," her tone wasn't angry, just firm. "You lost millions trying to recover earlier losses." The room froze. Benjamin shook his head. "That's not. You increased the size of each trade hoping to reverse the damage." The rival leaned back slightly in his chair, allowing the documents to speak for themselves. Another investor flipped through several pages. "Debt exposure has doubled." A second investor spoke more quietly. "If these markets move against these positions." The sentence stopped before it finished. Everyone at the table already understood the conclusion. Benjamin felt the weight of their attention turning toward him. Their temporary fluctuations. But the confidence in his voice had faded. The investors were no longer listening to his explanations. They were reading the numbers. The woman sitting beside Benjamin had grown very quiet. She slowly released her hand from his arm. "What is all this?" she asked softly. Benjamin didn't answer immediately. He was watching the investors, watching the way their expressions had changed. Respect replaced by calculation. Admiration replaced by concern. Across the table, Tiana closed the folder. "The company is close to financial collapse," she said calmly. Benjamin slammed his hand lightly on the table. "That's ridiculous." But the anger in his voice sounded defensive now. One of the investors looked at him carefully. "Benjamin, why weren't we told about these positions?" Benjamin hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice. The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. Then Benjamin's rival spoke. "If the company continues operating under its current structure," he said calmly, "bankruptcy becomes a very real possibility." Benjamin stood abruptly. "You don't get to sit here and lecture me about my own company." The rival met his gaze without emotion. "I'm not lecturing you." He paused. "I'm offering a solution." The investors looked up simultaneously. "What solution?" one of them asked. The rival folded his hands on the table. "My firm is prepared to acquire the company." Benjamin stared at him. "You're out of your mind." Tiana finally spoke again. "Benjamin." He turned toward her slowly. "The company can still survive," she said, "but not under your leadership." Benjamin felt the words hit harder than anything else that evening. "You're siding with him?" Tiana's expression remained calm. "I'm siding with reality." Across the table, the investors exchanged uneasy glances. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore, Benjamin Caldwell had invited them to dinner, expecting admiration. Instead, they had just witnessed the moment his empire began collapsing, and beside him, the woman he had brought to impress the room slowly pushed her chair back from the table. She looked at Benjamin one last time. "You didn't tell me any of this." Benjamin didn't answer, because for the first time in years, he had nothing left to say. For several seconds after Tiana finished speaking, no one at the table said anything. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Benjamin Caldwell remained standing beside his chair, staring at the financial documents spread across the table like they were written in a language he refused to understand. Across from him, the investors continued studying the pages. Numbers rarely create emotional reactions, but these numbers carried consequences. Finally, one of the investors spoke. "Benjamin, why weren't we informed about these trades?" Benjamin opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because the truth was obvious. There was no explanation that could make the situation look responsible. "They were temporary market positions," he said finally, but the sentence sounded weaker than he intended. Another investor leaned back slowly. "These positions exceed the company's liquidity." Benjamin's rival folded his hands calmly on the table. "That's correct." Benjamin glared at him. "You've said enough tonight." The rival did not react to the anger. Instead, he turned slightly toward the investors. "As I mentioned earlier, my firm is prepared to acquire the company." One of the investors looked up immediately. "Acquire?" "Yes." Benjamin laughed sharply. "This is absurd." But the rival continued speaking, as if Benjamin had not interrupted. "The operational infrastructure remains valuable. Distribution networks, technology, existing contracts." He tapped the financial folder gently. "But the current leadership has placed the company in a position where recovery may no longer be possible." Benjamin slammed his hand against the table. "You don't get to decide that." The rival's voice remained calm. "No." He glanced toward Tiana. "But the majority shareholder does." Every head at the table turned toward her. Benjamin followed their gaze slowly. "Tiana." She met his eyes without hesitation. "The company needs stability." Benjamin shook his head. "You're not serious." "You transferred the shares yourself," she said quietly. "That doesn't mean you can sell the company out from under me. It means I have the responsibility to protect it." Benjamin felt the room shifting further away from him. "You're betraying me." Tiana did not raise her voice. "You betrayed the company when you gambled with its future." The rival placed another document on the table, a preliminary acquisition agreement. One of the investors leaned forward to read it. "Your firm would assume the company's debt?" "Yes." "And maintain existing operations?" "Yes." The investor looked at the others. "That would protect our positions." Benjamin stared at them. "You're actually considering this?" Another investor spoke carefully. "We're considering survival." Benjamin felt anger rising again. "You built this company with me." "No," the investor replied quietly. "We invested in it." The difference mattered. The rival pushed the document slightly closer to Tiana. "With majority shareholder approval, the acquisition can move forward immediately." Benjamin looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "You planned this." "No," she replied softly. "You forced it." The room remained silent. Finally, Tiana picked up the document. She read it carefully. Then she signed. The sound of the pen touching paper seemed to echo across the table. Benjamin felt something inside him collapse at that moment. Years of ambition, years of reputation, years of believing he controlled everything, all reduced to a single signature. The rival took the document and reviewed it briefly. Then he nodded. "The acquisition process will begin tomorrow morning." Benjamin sank slowly into his chair. For the first time since entering the restaurant that evening, he understood the truth. He had just lost his company. The signature had barely dried on the paper when the atmosphere around the table changed completely. Only minutes earlier, the room had felt tense but uncertain. Investors had been weighing possibilities, analyzing numbers, and waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Now the uncertainty was gone. The decision had been made. Benjamin Caldwell sat motionless in his chair at the head of the table. For years, that seat had symbolized authority. Every investor meeting, every negotiation, every celebration of the company's growth had placed him in that same position, leading the conversation, shaping the direction of the business. Tonight, that authority had disappeared in front of everyone. Across the table, The investors began gathering the documents that had been spread across the surface. No one spoke to Benjamin directly. Instead, they exchanged quiet remarks with one another as they reviewed the acquisition agreement. One investor finally stood from his chair. "Well," he said calmly, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket, "this resolves the immediate financial risk." Another investor nodded. "It's probably the best outcome considering the circumstances." Benjamin heard the words clearly, but they sounded distant, like a conversation happening somewhere far away, because the reality settling over him felt unreal. His company, gone. Across the table, Benjamin's rival carefully placed the signed agreement back inside his folder. His expression remained composed, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way he closed the case. Years of competition had led to this moment, but he didn't celebrate. Business victories were rarely emotional. They were simply outcomes. The woman who had arrived at the restaurant with Benjamin shifted in her chair. For most of the evening, she had remained silent, trying to understand what was unfolding around her. But the final decision had made the situation impossible to ignore. She looked slowly from the investors to the rival, and finally to Benjamin. "You told me the company was expanding," she said quietly. Benjamin didn't answer. "You told me tonight was about celebrating a new chapter." Still no response. She studied his face carefully. The confident expression she had admired only an hour earlier was gone. In its place sat a man who looked stunned. "You didn't tell me any of this," she said. Benjamin finally spoke, though his voice sounded tired. "I didn't think it mattered." Her expression changed. "It mattered to me." Benjamin looked at her, but the connection that had existed earlier in the evening had already begun to fade. She reached for her purse and stood up slowly. The chair slid quietly across the floor. Several investors glanced in her direction. "Where are you going?" Benjamin asked. She looked down at him. For someone who claims to understand business so well. She paused briefly. "You should understand risk." Benjamin said nothing. "I don't stay where the future looks unstable." With that, she turned and walked away from the table. Her heels echoed softly across the restaurant floor as she moved toward the exit. Benjamin watched her go, not angry, not surprised, just aware that another part of the life he believed he controlled had just disappeared. Across the table, the investors began standing one by one. Several approached Benjamin briefly, not to comfort him, but to acknowledge the end of something. "We'll discuss the transition with the new ownership team tomorrow," one of them said. Benjamin nodded faintly. Another investor placed a hand lightly on the table. "You built something impressive once." The statement carried an unspoken message. Once, they left the restaurant quietly after that, one by one. Within minutes, the long table that had been filled with powerful business figures was nearly empty. Benjamin remained seated. Across from him, Benjamin's rival stood. "We'll begin stabilizing operations immediately," he said. Benjamin did not look up. "That's generous of you." The rival paused. Then he spoke one last sentence. "You built a strong foundation." Benjamin laughed quietly. "Just not strong enough to survive me." The rival didn't respond. Instead, he picked up the folder containing the signed acquisition agreement. Then he turned toward Tiana. She had remained seated quietly through most of the final exchanges. Now she stood slowly. Benjamin looked up at her. For a brief moment, the two of them simply looked at each other across the table. Years of memories existed between them. Good ones, complicated ones, moments that once felt permanent. Benjamin spoke first. "You really did this." Tiana nodded gently. "Yes." "You destroyed everything." "No." Her voice remained calm. "You did that." Benjamin looked away, because deep down, he knew she was right. Tiana picked up her purse. "Take care of yourself, Benjamin." The words were simple, not cruel, not sympathetic, just final. Then she turned and walked toward the restaurant exit. Benjamin watched her leave, and for the first time since he built the company. Benjamin Caldwell sat alone at a table where no one was listening to him anymore. Benjamin Caldwell did not leave the restaurant immediately. After Tiana walked out, after the investors disappeared into the Manhattan night, and after the staff quietly cleared several empty wine glasses from the table, Benjamin remained seated in the same chair. For the first time in years, no one was waiting for him to speak. The room that once felt like his stage now felt unfamiliar. The steakhouse still buzzed with conversation from other tables. Business deals continued at nearby booths. Waiters carried trays across the polished floor. Life inside the restaurant continued exactly as it always had. But for Benjamin, something fundamental had shifted. The chair across from him was empty. The chair beside him was empty. The long table that once held investors and partners now held only silence. Eventually, a waiter approached carefully. "Would you like anything else this evening, Mr. Caldwell?" Benjamin looked up slowly. For years, that question usually led to another bottle of wine or a dessert recommendation for clients. Tonight, he simply shook his head. No. The waiter nodded politely and stepped away. Benjamin sat there for several minutes longer before finally standing. His jacket felt heavier as he slipped it on. Outside, the cold Manhattan air hit his face the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk. Traffic moved past in steady streams of headlights. People walked along the street laughing, talking, living their lives without the slightest awareness of what had just happened inside the restaurant. Benjamin stood still for a moment. The city suddenly felt larger than it had earlier that evening. When he arrived at the restaurant, he believed he controlled his future. Now that future looked uncertain. He began walking slowly down the street. For years, Manhattan had felt like a place where ambition could shape reality. Every building represented opportunity. Every meeting held the possibility of expansion. Tonight, those same streets felt different. Not hostile, just indifferent. The city did not care whether Benjamin Caldwell succeeded or failed. He passed the glowing windows of several office towers where employees were still working late. Inside those buildings, people were planning tomorrow's deals and tomorrow's strategies. Benjamin understood something now that had been hidden from him during the years of success. Power in Manhattan is temporary. Reputation is fragile, and arrogance can erase both faster than most people realize. He stopped walking when he reached a quiet corner. Across the street, a reflection of city lights shimmered in a glass building. For a brief moment, he remembered the first time he met Tiana Carter at that charity gala years earlier. She had stood quietly near the edge of the room, watching people with the calm confidence that had intrigued him instantly. Back then, he admired her discipline, her independence, her intelligence. Those qualities once made him proud to stand beside her. Somewhere along the way, he had started seeing them as obstacles instead. Benjamin let out a slow breath. The realization arrived quietly. He had not lost his company because of one bad decision. He lost it because arrogance slowly replaced judgment. He believed admiration meant he could not fail. And when Tiana tried to warn him, he dismissed the one person who understood the numbers better than anyone else. Across the city, inside a car moving through evening traffic, Tiana Carter sat quietly in the back seat. Her hand rested gently on her stomach. The driver navigated through Midtown, while the lights of Manhattan moved across the window beside her. She felt tired, but the exhaustion carried relief with it. The past several months had required patience, discipline, and difficult decisions. Now the situation had finally reached its conclusion. The company would survive. Employees would keep their jobs. Investors would recover their positions. And Benjamin would have to confront the consequences of his choices. Tiana did not feel satisfaction about his downfall. Despite everything that had happened, Benjamin was still someone she once loved. He was also the father of the child she now carried. But love does not survive without respect, and respect cannot exist where arrogance takes control. The car stopped in front of her building. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked briefly at the quiet street. The future ahead of her looked different from the life she once imagined, but it also felt clear. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Never chase power. Build your life so power has to respect you. Tiana smiled softly. The lesson had guided her through every decision she made, and tonight it had proven true once again. Because real strength does not need to shout. It does not need admiration. Real strength is the ability to walk away from something broken and still protect what matters most. She placed a hand gently over her stomach. "We're going to be just fine," she whispered. Then Tiana Carter walked inside, leaving the noise of Manhattan behind her. And somewhere in that same city, Benjamin Caldwell continued walking through the cold night air, finally beginning to understand a truth success had hidden from him for years. Power without humility eventually destroys itself, but dignity lasts much longer. If this story moved you, take a second to think about the lesson hidden inside it. Sometimes the biggest downfall in life doesn't come from enemies or competition. It comes from the moment we stop listening to the people who truly care about us. Benjamin Caldwell believed power meant control, reputation, and admiration. Tiana Carter understood something deeper, that real strength is built on discipline, respect, and integrity. And in the end, those quiet values proved stronger than arrogance ever could. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Benjamin deserved what happened to him? Or do you believe he simply learned the hard way what pride can cost? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think about someone in your own life, someone who might need to hear this message, share it with them. Stories like this remind us that success without character can collapse overnight, but wisdom and dignity will always carry you forward. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if you enjoy powerful stories about life, relationships, and the choices that shape our future, make sure you subscribe to Mr. Kingswell Stories so you never miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, the strongest people in any room are rarely the loudest ones.